So I'm delighted to introduce award-winning journalist Keith O'Brien, a former staff writer for the Boston Globe, and you may have read his work in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and Politico, among other notable publications. You may have also heard his stories on All Things Considered in This American Life. O'Brien has written 3 books, including 2013's Outside Shot, Big Dreams, Hard Times, and One Country's Quest for Basketball Greatness. For this book, I believe Mr. O'Brien moved his entire family to Kentucky for 8 months. You can ask him questions about that so that he could follow a high school basketball team. In 2016, he co-wrote Catching the Sky with extreme athlete Colton Moore. This book was nominated for a PEN ESPN Award for literary sports writing. In his new book, Fly Girls, How 5 Daring Women Defied All Odds and Made Aviation History, O'Brien chronicles one of the most fascinating yet mostly forgotten parts of American history, when women shirked off social responsibilities and constraints and took to the skies. As an aviation enthusiast myself, I really enjoyed this book and was struck by how prescient these women's stories are, even 90 years later, and we could even say especially 90 years later. And I'm not the only one to give praise to this book. USA Today recently gave it 3.5 stars, and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch compared it favorably with Tom Wolfe's The Right Stuff. That, I think, is a really fitting comparison, both for the boundaries that the women themselves broke and also for the craftsmanship of O'Brien's narrative. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Keith O'Brien.
Thank you, Lori, for that very humbling introduction. I'd like to begin tonight, if I could, with a confession. I don't particularly like to fly. I'm not a brave flyer. I don't like turbulence. I don't like the little sounds that a plane makes in the middle of a flight for seemingly inexplicable reasons. And I really don't like takeoff. That moment where you're barreling down the runway at 100 miles an hour and jumping off into the air so fast you can feel the weight of the plane and the air on your chest as you move further and further away from the ground, from safety. I really don't like that moment at all. I have to travel, however, for work, and I do like to travel for pleasure, so not flying for me is not an option. So inevitably, you will find me in the 29th row of coach, in a middle seat, white-knuckling the armrest, as if I alone am holding up the plane. A few years ago, I was on one of these flights. I was flying from New Orleans to Chicago. And it was one of those flights where the pilot comes on before you take off and says, folks, it's going to be a bad flight. And he was right. You know, in the middle of that flight, we're bouncing around in the sky. It's night, it's dark, it's stormy. And there I am in my seat. I'm like trying to squirm up into a tiny little ball in my chair, but resisting to squirm up into a tiny little ball in my chair because that would be insane to squirm up into a tiny ball in your chair as an adult on a plane. And the woman next to me, she totally noticed. And she finally took pity on me. She turned to me and she said, honey, I think I can help you. I have Xanax. True story. So this is me. This is me as a flyer. And it sort of begs the question why someone like this, someone like me, would spend the last 2.5 years of his life researching, writing about airplanes in a time when plane travel was exponentially more dangerous than it is today. Why would I do that to myself? Why? And the answer is, it has nothing to do with airplanes. The reason why I was drawn to the story that ultimately became Fly Girls is because it's the story of an epic quest, populated by characters who were willing to risk everything, sacrifice everything to do the thing they loved. Characters who would have to fly through adversity after adversity, entrenched discrimination, and the deaths of their friends, who kept flying and then triumphed in the end. I mean, that's a story I would hope anyone would want to tell. I certainly knew I wanted to tell it. And I'm really, really excited to share it with you here this evening at this amazing bookstore here in Washington, D.C. I lived in D.C. for just a summer several years back when my wife was working here, and I would wander the shelves and the stacks of Politics and Prose, you know, wondering how could you, if you could make it here, you could make it anywhere, right? And so I'm here tonight, and it is a real thrill. So when I tell a story, whether it's for magazines or newspapers or radio or for a book, I like to think about it in terms of scenes, in terms of moments. Identify key scenes, key moments, and then build around those. And so I'd like to begin tonight with you with a moment. Imagine, if you can, September 1933. The waning days of summer, Labor Day weekend in Chicago, Illinois. The city had been struggling in the grip of the Great Depression for years. Record unemployment, bread lines down the street, flop houses so filled with thieves, that's what they called them, flop houses, filled with thieves that they would steal everything from you, even your shoes. But that weekend, Labor Day in Chicago, 1933, was going to be different. 400,000 people were streaming into Chicago by rail car and automobile. They were coming for an exciting event. They were coming for the air races. Forget about what you know about modern day air shows. Our polished, scripted flying events with the greatest planes in the world. Air racing in the 1920s and 30s was a real sport with winners, losers, jackpots of money for the victors, and massive crowds. It was, at the time, one of the most popular sports in America, and it was definitely the most dangerous. Inevitably, these planes, single propeller, open cockpit machines, primarily, flying at a high rate of speed, 50 to 75 feet off the ground, would crash. Crash at times right in front of the grandstand, and the pilots would die there. Because of this danger, because of the excitement, many men believed it was no place for a woman. It sounds crazy to us now. It's sexist, it's demeaning, it's absurd. We have to remember at the time, in the late 1920s, there were laws on the books in this country that forbade women from doing all sorts of things, from serving on juries, from running for elected office in some states, for filing lawsuits. Women couldn't work the night shift. Women couldn't drive taxi cabs in any American city. Women were denied the right to work in as many as 15 different professions during this time. And they were denied other basic rights too. Around this time, late 1920s, right here in Washington, a theater roof collapsed, killing a small boy. And the mother wished to sue the theater company for negligence, a case she likely would have won. But laws denied her that right. Only a father could collect damages for the wrongful death of a minor. And this boy's father was already dead, meaning the mother in question here had no husband, no child, and no recourse. Women hoping to fly airplanes, faced similar challenges. Late 1920s, 1928, we're 7, 8 years removed from women winning the right to vote in this country. There are 30 million registered female voters in the presidential election of 1928. That year, the start of that year, there were fewer than a dozen with a pilot's license on file with the Department of Commerce. It's a little bit tricky. There were lots of ways to report licenses in those days. Still, the number was minuscule. A fraction of a fraction of a fraction of the female population in this country, meaning the few women who did fly were true radicals. Labor Day weekend in Chicago, 1933, one of those women was about to do the most radical thing of all. She was going to race the men in her airplane, whipping it around pylons, small towers placed on the ground in Chicago in a triangular course. She was 29 years old, this woman, divorced and afraid of nothing. Her plane was so fast as to be known to be dangerous. Indeed, this model of plane, built in Springfield, Massachusetts, had killed many men. But the woman knew what she was doing. She knew how to fly it. At the end of lap 1, at the home pylon there in Chicago, the crowd knew it too. As she reached that home pylon, flying 200 miles an hour, just 50 to 70 feet off the deck. She banked her plane so hard, so perfectly, that it stood up on its wing. "Just look at that girl," the announcer said. Those are his words. "Just look at that girl. Have you ever seen such a beautiful race?" She was trailing the two leaders, but she was vying for third place. She was right there. And then, at the 8th turn at the home pylon, a problem. The right wing of her fast plane began to disintegrate in mid-flight. Pieces of the wing blew off in chunks, falling to the ground like so much confetti. And with the wind now whistling through the holes in her wing, she did as she was supposed to do. She peeled off course, flying away from her competitors in the crowd, south toward the city of Chicago, out over Glenview Road and Lake Avenue. She was trying to gain altitude to save the crowd and herself. Everyone now at the airfield is watching her little red plane in the sky, knowing one of two things is about to happen. She will bail out from a dangerously low altitude, or she will crash. Either way, it probably wasn't going to end well. That woman's name was Florence Klingensmith. You probably haven't heard of her. Most people haven't. You know, when we think about women in aviation in the 1920s and 30s, we tend to think about one woman, Amelia Earhart, as if she was all alone, flying solo against angry headwinds. But in the time that Earhart flew, she was shoulder to shoulder with other women that formed a small, scrappy squadron in the sky. Each of them was brave. Each of them was bold. Some of them arguably were more talented, more skilled in a cockpit than Earhart. Today, we've forgotten almost everything about them. We've forgotten their battles, their losses, their friendships, their rivalries, what they fought for, how long they fought. We've even forgotten in the end their impossible victory. With this book, I hope to play a small role in changing that. You know, reminding readers of a time and of these characters, you know, women who stood up for themselves and for each other again and again and again. Defiant in the face of rules intended to keep them in their place. And also confident in the knowledge of who they were. I'd like to introduce you to them if I could. Ruth Elder is a flashy Alabama housewife. In 1927, she's on her second marriage, now living in Lakeland, Florida, answering telephones at a dentist's office. It is not the life that Ruth Elder has imagined for herself. And when Charles Lindbergh flies the Atlantic in the spring of 1927, Ruth Elder decides she will be the first woman to ever fly across the ocean. A dream for which Ruth Elder will pay an awful price. Amelia Earhart, who came next. You know, in our quest to try to figure out what happened to Amelia in the end, we seem to have forgotten everything about the life she lived. In 1928, Amelia Earhart was not a famous flyer. She was a social worker in Boston, and also not too satisfied about that station in her life. Amelia Earhart would become famous in the spring of 1928, not for flying the Atlantic solo. She'd become famous for riding across the ocean in a plane flown by men. That's what made Amelia Earhart famous to begin with. But to her credit, to Amelia's enduring credit, she knew that that accomplishment meant little, that it was a gimmick. She knew, as she would later say, she was just cargo on that flight. And she would spend the rest of what would be a very short life making daring flights and at times reckless flights, almost in an answer to her critics. Because, again, we've forgotten this, but it's true, Amelia Earhart did have critics. Ruth Nichols, who was a daughter of Wall Street wealth, born on the Upper East Side of New York and raised in Westchester County in a mansion. Before the stock market crash of 1929, Ruth Nichols had money, but she desperately wanted everything that Amelia Earhart had. And would come so close at times to eclipsing Amelia Earhart as being known as the most accomplished female aviator in this country. Florence Klingensmith was raised in rural Minnesota, worked at a dry cleaner's, was dissatisfied with that, and decided she wanted to fly after seeing Charles Lindbergh visit the town of Fargo in August 1927. Not only would she fly, not only would she race men, Florence Klingensmith would prove she was one of the most talented flyers of her time. And finally, Louise Thaden. Louise was, in my opinion, almost the rarest of aviators in the late 1920s. She was not just a woman who flew and raced airplanes, she was a mother. She had her first child in 1930 and her second in 1933. Her second child, I should note, just because we're here in Washington tonight, is still alive today. She lives in Leonardtown, Maryland, and will be turning 85 years old this fall. Louise, did something very extraordinary during this time. At a time when our culture, and indeed many husbands, expected their wife to stay home and raise children, Louise did something that many of us do today. She tried to have it all. She tried to juggle her personal ambitions and her career goals with her love for her children and her responsibilities at home. And because of the sacrifices that Louise made over the years to be with her children while still trying to have her career, we have forgotten her. These women were all different. Some came from money, some didn't. Some were educated, some weren't. Ruth Nichols graduated from Wellesley College outside of Boston. Florence Klingensmith didn't graduate from high school in Minnesota. But they did have some commonalities, which I tried to identify early on because I felt it would help me understand them more if I could see how they were the same. And it's just a few things, really. The first is they were all daring and they were all different, and they knew they were different from a young age. Amelia Earhart liked to cut off her hair 1 inch at a time so that her mother wouldn't notice this transgression. She wanted to wear her hair short, even though most girls weren't allowed to do such things. Louise Thaden liked to jump out of the second story of her barn in Arkansas just to see what it felt like, or work on the car engine with her father. She didn't like wearing the frilly southern white dresses that her mother would make her wear for photographs. She wanted to wear overalls and go get dirty with the boys, as she would say. Florence Klingensmith, in the small little town where she was raised in rural Minnesota, rode a motorcycle at a time when teenage girls simply didn't ride motorcycles. And when she would go to the town of Moorhead there on the Red River, she wouldn't ride the little streetcar in town sitting in a chair like everybody else. She liked to cling to the cow catcher up front, to the horror of the conductor and also her high school classmates. They were different from a young age. They were also what we would call today early adopters. We take flying for granted now. I flew here, and at best it's a fast way to get from one place to another. At worst, we complain about it. Complain about the leg room or the fees that the airlines charge. In the late 1920s, flying was magic. It was romantic. And it was also very dangerous. A lot of men refused to fly in airplanes. And so the fact that these women not only wanted to fly, but then race, and then would advocate to others and say, flying is the future. We'll all be flying an airplane soon. They would say those kind of things at a time when most people simply didn't. And then, I guess the last thing that I found interesting about all of them is what they shared in their parents. Their parents were different on paper. They were lawyers and Wall Street traders, but also farmers and day laborers and bus drivers. But they did share one thing in common. At a time when parents could in particular tell a young girl, you will not marry this man, or you will marry this man, or you will go do this job, but not that job. these parents, in particular the fathers, either tacitly approved of their daughter's interest in aviation by turning the other way, or they actively encouraged it, encouraged their daughters to fly. Ruth Nichols' father bought her first ride in a plane in Atlantic City, changed everything for Ruth. At a time when fathers, would typically like to have their daughters get married early or choose a more traditional profession, these fathers didn't do that. And so, for me as a parent myself, I learned something about that. Let your child wear pants if he or she wants to, or a dress if he or she wants to. Let them wear their hair short or long. Let them follow their own path, because as we see with these women, you never know where it's going to lead. So I'd like to read to you briefly, and then I'd be happy to take any questions you might have. I'm going to read to you from a passage early in the book. This is September 1927. Again, we're just about 4 months removed from Charles Lindbergh flying across the Atlantic solo. And it's important to remember one thing about that historic flight, which again, we've simplified today. Lindbergh didn't just make this flight across the ocean for the pioneering historic spirit of it all. He was doing it for a jackpot of money. In 1919, a rich hotelier in New York City offered up $25,000 to the first man, and it was believed to be a man, to fly nonstop from New York to Paris or Paris to New York. For many years, nobody had tried to make this flight because it was way too dangerous. But in 1926, as planes started to catch up to the possibilities of actually making such a flight, men began attempting to do it. Many men disappeared over the ocean, never to be found again. Many died. Charles Lindbergh made it. When he did, he became not only famous, but also rich with the jackpot he won. He returned to America to then receive another jackpot of money, $50,000, to fly across America in a 90-city goodwill tour. So Lindbergh's making his tour. He's inspiring people to want to fly, and he surprisingly inspired a woman in Lakeland, Florida. Her name was Ruth Elder. As I said, she was working at a dentist's office. She is now determined to be the first woman to fly across the ocean. Ruth Elder breezed into Long Island that September, 4 months after Lindbergh's flight, landing at Roosevelt Field with the subtlety of a gale. Her colorful sweaters were tight, and her brown hair was bobbed in the latest style. The Alabama native almost never appeared without a rainbow-hued scarf wrapped around her head, pinning back her wild curls. Her airship was equally eye-catching. The single-engine Stinson Detroiter monoplane was a brilliant shade of orange. The color had less to do with flair than practicality. In a wide expanse of gray-blue ocean, the floating wreckage of an orange plane was easier to spot, say, than the remains of a silver one. But Elder and her male co-pilot, a Floridian named George Haldeman, had no intention of putting her plane in the water. It was too beautiful, too perfect, all the way down to the name painted on the fuselage in large, sweeping, cursive script. American Girl. Gas bought, runway ready, plane dandy, pilots okay, Elder told reporters in their first meeting at Roosevelt Field, already commanding their attention with her looks, style, and distinctive high-pitched voice. Give us a weather break and we'll take off then. What's your hurry, one reporter asked. Say, she replied, I've been dreaming and planning this ever since I first learned to fly 2 years ago. Then Lindbergh did it and I was more determined. I want to be the first girl to turn the trick. I'll do it, I and Captain Haldeman. Do you only want to fly to Paris because you are a girl? Another reporter asked. Well, they've got pretty evening gowns there, I hear, Elder joked. Then more seriously, she added, I've never been to Europe, might as well go this way, get some clothes, doll up a little, come back by boat, taking it easy, no flying back for me. The reporters wanted to know everything about her. Was she married, engaged, or was she and Haldeman together maybe? No, Elder replied. No and no, especially to the last question. Say, listen, insulted Haldeman interjected. I'm married. Was Elder afraid, and would she back out in the end? Be honest. Or would her family ultimately talk her out of it? No, she replied again, and no. They've been perfect peaches, she told them. Elder had been in New York for a half an hour. hadn't even left the airfield to check into her room at the nearby Garden City Hotel, and already the New York press was picking her apart. Reporters described her nose, perfectly powdered. They called her vain, criticizing her purse or knickers, and they pushed the 24-year-old woman again and again to admit that she wasn't truly serious about her transatlantic plans. "What's this you're doing?" another bewildered newspaperman asked her. "Advertising a movie or just getting yourself well enough known to be offered a vaudeville contract?" "Oh no," Elder said. "I'm really going to fly to Paris." Didn't they understand? "I'm here to fly," she said, quickly. Looking out at the reporters and beyond them the long clay runway where Lindbergh had prevailed, Elder must have felt as if she'd flown the American girl not to Long Island, but to an altogether different world. She was from Anniston, Alabama, one of 7 children raised by Sarah and J.O. Elder downtown on Noble Street. The house there was the latest in a string of modest homes rented by the Elders with money J.O. made as either a farm laborer or a molder in a pipe fitting shop, all of which wasn't good enough for Ruth, J.O.'s third oldest child and thrill-seeking daughter. She left home shortly after her 18th birthday and moved 60 miles west to Birmingham, the city, Elder called it. She rented a room in a boarding house there, and her parents figured she'd be back in Anniston soon. Instead, Elder began leading a life that she kept secret, and now desperately hoped to hide from the New York reporters. She got a job selling lingerie in a department store, and she got a husband. But the marriage didn't take. She was divorced and then in 1925, married again, this time to Lyle Womack, an electric sign salesman. Together, the pair moved to Lakeland, Florida, where for a time anyway, they lived an ordinary life east of Tampa. Elder got a job in a dentist's office, and Womack helped introduce his young wife to flying and also to some Florida businessmen who were fond of both golf and schemes. In Elder, the men chasing Limburgian fame saw an opportunity. The Floridians wanted to put Elder over the ocean, with George Haldeman, a well-known local pilot, doing most of the flying, and Elder doing most of the smiling. They pitched their idea to some wealthy snowbirds from West Virginia on a golf course in Lakeland, and these men saw value in the plan. As financial backers, they would make money by shooting footage of Elder and selling it to Hollywood. There was just one caveat. She would have to say she had never been married. The men were marketing a product, and it couldn't be labeled Mrs. Lyle Womack. The West Virginians, intrigued, agreed to put up $35,000 to buy a plane and make it happen, believing Elder was the right woman for the job. She was, men like to point out, the most beautiful pilot they'd ever seen. So pretty, one said, that it doesn't seem right. She was, to put it another way, the fairest of the brave and the bravest of the fair. She would make it to Paris or she wouldn't. She would live to tell the tale or she would die. Either way, the reporters would get their story. Either way, the West Virginians were insured. And either way, Elder figured, it was better than playing out her years working at a dentist's office in Florida and making dinner for her husband. The trick was getting Haldeman to teach her to fly and then getting him to go with her across the ocean. He hated instructing women. Inevitably, they always ended up crying about something, Haldeman complained. But Elder wore him down, not with her beauty, but with dogged determination. "I've lived for a while without amounting to a plug nickel," she told one reporter after arriving in New York. "I want to do something that will make people notice me, that may give me an opportunity to get somewhere in the world." "Is it worth risking your life?" the reporter asked. "Yes, it is," she replied. There was really only one way for Elder to screw up the deal: by losing to another woman who had dreams, money, and a plane of her own. That woman was staring out at the ocean too, 300 miles to the north. Be happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you. Oh, and yes, if you have a question, please go to the microphone. Thank you. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah. Oh. So as a reporter, I obviously typically am interviewing people who are alive. This story is completely different. The last main character of this book died in 1979. So they are long gone, and indeed most people who knew them, who flew with them, who could speak to their bravery are long gone too, with the exception of Louise's daughter, who lives in Leonardtown. But in the time that Louise, her mother, was flying, she was a young girl. So even she couldn't speak to what it was like for her mother. It was just lovely to sit with her and get to know her mother, because you do learn about somebody when you sit with their daughter or their mother. But that was the rare case. Almost all of these characters had to be built out of whole cloth from newspaper accounts, magazine accounts, old radio recordings, and of course archival stuff, letters, diaries, flight logs, flight plans, fan mail, anything I could get my hands on I wanted. It was harder for some versus others. Florence Klingensmith died a long time ago, and she had no children, no descendants. And so early on, I did wonder, how will I be able to bring Florence back to life in 3 dimensions on the pages of this book? And I did struggle to find her archives initially. They weren't here at the Air and Space Museum. They weren't at any major university. They weren't at any aviation museum at all. And finally, just sort of getting desperate, I called the tiny little historical society in the little town where she went to high school. I wasn't holding out much hope, frankly, at this point. And I got the archivist on the phone. His name was Mark Peel. And I explained to Mark who I was and what I was looking for. And I asked, do you have anything on Florence Klingensmith? I wasn't sure, frankly, if he would even know who she was. And God bless Mark Peel. He paused for a moment and he said, well, I've been collecting stuff on Florence Klingensmith for 30 years. And I sort of freaked out in my mind. And then I said, Mark, can I fly to Fargo this Friday? And so those were little finds that helped along the way. Ruth Nichols was similar in that way. She lived a long time, and she came from money in New York, and she knew her whole life she was someone. And so the opposite of Florence, I was convinced Ruth Nichols' papers were somewhere, absolutely convinced of it. But I couldn't find them. They weren't anywhere in all these usual places. I visited finally a little museum at a lakefront airport in Cleveland. It's the International Women's Air and Space Museum. It's about 1/3 the size of this room right here. And on my first visit there, I asked for everything you had on Ruth Nichols. And I got sort of like a newspaper clipping file. I already had the newspapers. And so I was pretty disappointed. But I continued to search online. I continued to do a million Google searches. And I finally found this finding aid that seemed to be connected to Ruth Nichols' papers at the International Women's Air and Space Museum in Cleveland. So I called them back and I asked, could you check again? Because it looks like you might have this. And the staffer went to the back and said, oh, I just checked the back room. And yes, there is some file cabinets labeled Ruth Nichols. And it seems to have a lot of stuff. And what he might think is a lot of stuff is not what I think is a lot of stuff. So I said, can you take a picture of these file cabinets for me? I'm trying to figure out, is this really worth it, or is it really what I'm thinking? And he took a picture of a wall of cabinets. And, I flew back to Cleveland. I went into this little cinder block room, no windows. Old race trophies are everywhere. It's clutter and file cabinets. And I spent the first hour just opening these drawers, trying to figure out what was there, and it was one of those moments where, I knew I could bring Ruth back to life again, because there she was. There she was. Yes.
My niece, Christina, is a Lockheed Martin employee. Her daughter is named Amelia. Can you tell me anything about this new British effort to try to find Earhart's plane? And I read the portions of your book last night that talked about the end of the Earhart flight. So
just to be clear, my story really focuses on 1927 and 1936. So 1937 and beyond is like epilogue material. But of course, you can't write a book featuring Earhart without even wanting to know yourself what might have happened. And so, of course, I did dig into it a little. What I can say is this. In the time that I began writing this book, about every 6 months, some new story comes out about what happened to Amelia. And to paint them with a broad brush, I would say this. There's very little new about what we have heard in the last 2 years. Rumors that she was captured and killed by the Japanese began during World War II. The report that there were bones found on an island in the South Pacific dates back to the early 1940s. And the most recent reports about radio calls were also common at the time. They filled contemporary newspapers in July of 1937 about people claiming to hear Earhart. You could write an entire book about this. I won't belabor the point. But what I will say is, is it plausible that she was found a coral reef or a small atoll, landed her plane there without a major mishap, was able to radio for a couple days, and then died there? Sure, it's plausible. George Putnam, her husband, long believed, at least during the search, that that's exactly what happened. But it's also important to remember that the Navy mounted the largest search in its history, combing a stretch of ocean about the size of Texas, with 100 airplanes, 10 ships, and thousands of people. And these Navy pilots flew low, very low, over these atolls that were on their maps, finding nothing in early July 1937. And so, just speaking, nobody can say definitively what happened. I certainly can't. There are researchers who've spent years of their lives trying to solve this question. That wasn't the story I was telling here. But just speaking from a likelihood perspective, the most likely thing is she hit the water of the open ocean and she drowned. It's certainly what aviators themselves believed at the time. If you read the next day's coverage in Honolulu, which was the nearest paper to where she went down, and they were waiting for Amelia. She was flying there. So the reporters are amassed on the island of Hawaii to greet her when she comes. And when the reporters went down to the field to interview the aviators about what do you think happened to Amelia, the aviators just shook their heads. Because when you went down or you went missing over the ocean in the 1920s and 30s, everybody knew that you were gone. Yes.
So you wrote about 5 women. I'm curious, after you wrote the book, after all the research and you're done writing the book, who ended up being your favorite? Like, who would you go have dinner with? Who is the one that you would most likely want to hang out with? If you can pick a favorite.
Who would I have a beer with?
Yes.
We're in Washington,
okay.
Right? Yeah.
Who would you have
which politician would have a beer with? No, I'm just joking. Great question. The easy answer, of course, would be Amelia. You'd want to talk to her about her journey, and hopefully we could learn a little bit about what did happen in 1937. I think my answer to that question would depend on what kind of mood I was in on each day. But I think today I would say Ruth Nichols. She was different than the others in that she came from money. But in some ways that put her in a box. She had expectations to marry young, to marry well, to be covered by the newspapers as she married young and married well. And she chose a different path, at times, in defiance of her family and their expectations. And we've forgotten that, in 1931, Ruth was, just objectively speaking, the most accomplished female aviator in this country. And 1 year later, in 1931, she would set out to be the first woman to fly solo across the ocean. This is 1 year before Amelia herself would go. And, Ruth knew her whole life that she was someone. And it dogged her to the end of her life that she didn't become the person that she hoped to be, even though, I think, as you'll see, she was an incredible American. Yes.
How did you come up with the idea to write this kind of a book?
So ironically enough, I was on an airplane in the spring of 2016. I was flying from Boston to Pittsburgh for a story I was doing for Politico magazine at the time about the unlikely possibility that Donald Trump could carry Pennsylvania in the fall. And for this flight, I grabbed a book that had been sitting on my desk, my bedside table for some time. It was Lily Koppel's The Astronaut's Wives Club. It's a book about the wives of the first 7 astronauts. nonfiction. One of my favorite books of all time was Tom Wolfe's The Right Stuff. And so I really did want to see how she had done this from the opposite perspective, told this story from the perspective of the wives. And I'm very early in the book. I'm on the plane. I'm totally calm, by the way. I'm not having a panicked flight, white knuckling at all. And I'm on like page 16, and there was this paragraph about daring women in the early part of the 20th century. And there was one line about an airplane race in 1929, all women, featuring Amelia Earhart. I had never heard of such a thing. And, you know, as a journalist, I'm always looking for story ideas and just writing them down in a little notepad in my back pocket. And in this case, I was on a plane, and it was a plane that had Wi-Fi. And so I'm stuck in coach. I got my laptop, I got Wi-Fi. I opened up my computer, and I just started noodling around on it. And, you know, you can't find a book idea on Google. I know I didn't. I don't want to be glib about it. But it was interesting enough there. What interested me was, as I went to Wikipedia and searched some of these airplane races, here were these lists of women who had flown in them, and I didn't know almost any of them. And that's what sent me to the library. And once I got in the library and was living amid old microfilm is when it really all came together. And I realized that there was this world here, this entire world that we had forgotten. And these brave pilots who had been a part of it that we had forgotten too. And I just knew I wanted to tell that story. So the question is about, you know, I've got 5 women listed in the subtitle here. There were obviously lots of brave women flying at that time, in particular in one race that was known as the Powder Puff Derby. A little bit of background about that. So yes, it is a part of the book. And before I get into that, I think it's important to say, you know, that this isn't like some encyclopedic retelling of 5 different women's stories in 5 little sections. This is a story of an ensemble cast of women who were rivals, but also friends, the sort of people who would rush to one another's bedside when they were injured in a crash and would be there for them, who fought each other in the sky in the races, but also fought the men on the ground for the rights they wanted in the sky for the years to come. And so, you know, that's why these 5 women are sort of at the heart and soul of this story. But you're absolutely right. You know, in the late 1920s, in 1929, the first all-female air race happened from Santa Monica to Cleveland. 20 women were in that race. One of them would die in that race. And, you know, it's an interesting jumping off point because the men had been flying in these kind of transcontinental derbies for years. Women wanted in. And Louise Thaden and Amelia Earhart in particular began lobbying in 1928 and early 1929 that they absolutely needed to be included in that Labor Day's air races. And the men and the male organizers in particular liked the idea of it because when a woman flew, it always drew attention. It always drew headlines because they were so rare. But, of course, the men wanted the women to fly on their terms. So initially, they said, yes, you can fly from Santa Monica to Cleveland, but you must do so, each of you, accompanied by a man. And we're not going to let you fly from Santa Monica to Cleveland. You must start on the eastern side of the Rockies and say Omaha. Amelia Earhart and Louise Thaden would have none of it. And in June 1929, they announced that if these rules stood, they would boycott. 2 of the most famous female flyers in America would boycott. It was bad press. It was bad attention for the air races. So they allowed them to fly with one caveat. Men who flew in transcontinental derbies could fly any which way they wanted. You could take off from New York and refuel in Cleveland and Wichita, or you could refuel in Kansas City, and that's it. The women had mandatory stops. They had to stop in 15 different places, essentially puddle jumping across America. The female aviators were very upset about this rule, but they knew that if they didn't accept it, they wouldn't be allowed to fly at all. But it had an interesting effect that no one had counted on. Because they had to stop everywhere, like every 150 miles. across the country. They filled the pages of American newspapers for about 9 days. And by the time they arrived in Cleveland, Louise Thaden, Amelia Earhart, Ruth Nichols, Ruth Elder, others were now some of the most famous women in the world. So thank you for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it. I'd like to, I'd like to close by saying, that as a reporter, as a journalist, I've always tried to tell the untold stories of the underrepresented. And I do think we live in a time now where that kind of reporting is more important maybe than ever before. And, I think these women would be excited to know that their story lives on, that their lives still have meaning. This book came out last week, last Tuesday, and I was in New York that day, and I had just a couple of free hours that morning to do something I'd wanted to do during the reporting of the book but never had time to do, and that is visit the grave of Ruth Nichols. She's buried just north of Manhattan in the Bronx in a place called Woodlawn Cemetery. If you were important in New York City in the 19th and 20th century, chances are you're buried in Woodlawn. And so, I wanted to go there to pay my respects. And I took the train from Manhattan up to the Bronx, and I went to the office at Woodlawn Cemetery because you have to check in there. And I told them who I was coming to see, and they gave me a map of this sprawling cemetery, which is, I don't know, it's 2 miles long by foot, just walking it. And I gave me the map, and I looked at it, and they were trying to help me find where I was going. And all the famous people who are buried in Woodlawn are noted on the map with an icon. Ruth Nichols wasn't on the map. And so with the help of the staffer in the office and their app and the map, I wandered out into Woodlawn to find her grave. And, I initially went to the wrong place, and I had to stop and look at the app and the map again, and then finally wandered over to the right place. And I found her grave. Woodlawn Cemetery is filled with giant mausoleums. Some of them are truly, literally shaped like Egyptian crypts. Ruth Nichols' grave wasn't like that at all. It was a normal tombstone, just like you or I one day might be buried under. And all it had on it was her name, her date of birth, her date of death. And at the bottom, sort of obscured in the ivy, was just 3 words. It said, "Beloved by all." And it sort of hit me, she was once. They all were once. And I do hope that they will be again. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.